Today's guest is a powerhouse of purpose, a U.S. Navy veteran, speaker, comedian, preacher, and the host of the Raw and Real Couple O Nukes podcast. He goes by Mr. Whiskey, and his mission is clear: to help people confront their darkest battles and walk out the other side with purpose, humor, and hope. Raised in a home marked by chaos, abuse, addiction, and religious trauma, he developed an unshakable radar for what's real when it comes to healing and survival. Against the odds, he completed the Navy's elite nuclear training pipeline and served during the most grueling refuel and overhaul in carrier history, an era known for its staggering suicide rates and toxic command climate. Today, he's channeling his lived experience into something bigger: suicide prevention, addiction recovery, faith, creativity, and second chances. Whether he's talking to veterans, Gen Z, artists, or outcasts, his message stays the same: you're not alone, and your story isn't over. Get ready for a conversation that doesn't flinch, where faith meets failure, and where scars turn into strategy. This is Mr. Whiskey. This is going to be a ride you don't forget. Hey, welcome. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me. You know, I always start with gratitude for the opportunity for you and I to connect, and for you letting me share with all your listeners here. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely, man. You got an amazing story that we're going to dig into today. Let's start out with what brought you to the Navy.
Yeah, so I don't have one of those cool stories like most people where they say, hey, the Air Force recruiting office was closed, or I want to kill people. My story is a lot more simple. It was mom and dad said, you're doing this, you're 17, and that was that.
Right?
To give a more detailed version, my whole life was set up for the Coast Guard Academy. And if I knew what I know now about the military, I would have not turned down that opportunity like I did. Officers have a different lifestyle than I certainly imagined. And we can have a conversation about that another time. But I had been prepared through summer programs and through my parents to just do the Coast Guard Academy. They always put that onto my life, said it was my dream. Quote, because once when I was 5 years old, a Coast Guard helicopter flew by the beach. I was like, that's really cool. I'd love to do that. And so nothing else was allowed after that point, even though I also said I want to be a cowboy and an astronaut and all. I've done most of those now. But yeah, I walked away from that opportunity because eventually my first job as ice cream salesman on the beach, I got to talk to people. And, you know, they always ask the question, are you working for college or what's your plan? And I said, well, my parents are sending me to the Coast Guard Academy. Hoo-yah. And you know, a lot of adults were like, well, what do you want? I was like, me, I have a choice. You know, I'm just a kid and my parents are telling me this. And they said, well, you know, once you graduate, you're on your own. You can do what you want. And I really want to be an entrepreneur and you know, work and make something. And then COVID happened, senior year of high school for me. March, they said, hey, we're going to go on a little 2-week break and come back. Never came back, never graduated, no prom, nothing. You know, that was it. And so the working world and entrepreneurism was gone. And college was an option for me just because parents had never prepared me for it. And considering that I made it through one of America's most vigorous academic programs, the nuclear pipeline, and was one of very few people from the original group who actually made it through, I'm sure I could have done college. But at the time, I had a very, the view I had of college was very skewed by, it's not at all what I thought it was. You know, I imagined this world of, you know, 9 to 10 hours of class every day and homework for 10 hours afterward and all these books and, you know, all this stuff. But I said, hey, how about I do community college? And my dad said, nope, community college is for minorities and bums and you're too smart. You know, you're a whiskey. You can't be doing that. And so I never thought of doing college life. You know, that was no. Work world shut down. Parents said, you're going into the military. So I said, all right. And I joined the Air Force the day before I ship out and sign everything finalized. Recruiter calls me, hey, about that job I told you, guaranteed. I never said the word guaranteed. I said, we could get you that job, but that billet's filled and, you know, we don't need any more photojournalists. So you're actually going to be a cryptolinguist because I liked your ASVAB score. And you're going to learn another language and spy on another country about 14 hours a day in a plane. And I said, no, I'm not. And I did not want to do Air Force. You know, they had led me on, lied to me. Not the only branch to do that. Fair disclaimer, not the only branch of recruiting to do that to me. But yeah, that was that. And he said, well, look at some other jobs in the Air Force. And I did. And you know what? There was everything you could imagine. Mailman, pest control, construction. It was a second civilian world. Parents said, nope, you dishonor the family, you're cut out if you take any job other than that highest job. He offered you the number one job. That's what you're taking, for the sake of their pride, even though they had no one to, show me off to. But I said, no, then I'm not doing the Air Force. Parents put me into the Navy for photojournalism. That billet got filled, of course, because every photojournalist in the military stays in and enlists, multiple times.
Yep.
So ended up going for underwater welding, took the ASVAB. They said, you're a nuclear operator. I said, I already don't want to do this, but I might as well just, because they said, hey, this is the worst job, but the best benefits. I said, well, I already don't want to do the military to begin with. I might as well suck it up even more. And, if I get the most out of it as I can.
Yep.
That was a mistake. But there are not, unless you stay blue collar nuclear industry, you and I had the same military veteran benefits as the mailman, the
Yep.
pet control guy, as the store clerk. So that was, and here we are today.
I was definitely wondering what extra benefits you were gonna get.
Bragging rights.
Yeah, a lot of people don't even understand that, even the pay is the same all the way across the board. I've in one branch is paid the same as an E5 in another branch.
My mailman makes more money than an E4 nuclear operator.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, absolutely. So, everybody's got different stories that brings them to the military. For me, it was I got married right out of school and lost my job, so I needed a job, and so I went active duty. That was back in '94. It was literally a 9-to-5 job back then. The worst thing you had to do was go to the field. And then after 9/11, you've got the newer generation that came in. That was all about coming in and joining and wanting to fight for the country. And I got a lot of respect for those guys because they knew what they were doing when they came in. I don't think they fully understood. And I don't think I literally have had soldiers tell me they thought it was going to be like Call of Duty. And
I can believe that. Well,
yeah.
I think that what always makes me laugh is I've had some people on my show, they said, I joined the Army for college. And then 2 weeks later, 9/11 happened, so they were like that free ride to college suddenly came with a lot more requirements than the past, 10 years.
Yeah.
And poor timing. Actually, the best was a Vietnam veteran on my show. He goes, you know what? I woke up on a pool table in a bar drunk. And I said, I heard a radio ad for the Marines. And I said, you know what? Let's go get my life together. 9 months later, I was in a rice paddy field in Vietnam. I said, I made a mistake. Yeah. I don't know what I was thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, everybody's got their own challenges, and one of the things in the Army that we hear and say all the time is, hey man, give it a chance. This isn't the Army. This is this unit. It sucks. When you go to your next unit, you'll find the Army. And that's what the Army is really about. And I spent 20 years looking for it. I don't know where the hell it was at because, the only thing that really changed was the amount of assholes that you worked for. Some had less, some had more. It was the people that made the unit. And it takes 20 years to figure that out, I guess.
Well, I always say command climate can make or break your experience.
Yeah.
It really will. Because I said, listen, you could be in Hawaii, beautiful place, with the worst chain of command ever. You won't re-enlist. I said, you can be in Newport News, the worst place to be stationed, one of them, and have the best command climate and re-enlist. It's so much, like you said, the people and your leaders, because they just, in the military, they control everything. It's not just your job, it's your life.
Well, so let me ask this. You said in your bio, it says that you grew up in a household full of chaos. Can you elaborate what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'll start with just the summaries, which would be religious weaponization, sexual abuse, domestic violence, emotional and verbal abuse, conformity and control. So it looks like a lot of different things. And that includes in the later years, specifically high school onward, the alcoholism and addiction of my father played a huge role in that. A lot of fighting between my parents. He had broken my mother's skull and half of her face is made out of metal. So, that sets up, and I didn't know this until later on in life, until 20, plus years later, but that had a lot of effects that played in the background in their relationship, in the way they parented, in the way they loved each other. And so there was a lot. My dad kind of chose for me what friends I was allowed to have, what enemies I had, where we could go. And the best example I always give is, I was on the submarine base, and just come off a ship, operating all day, all kinds of stuff, nuclear power, steam demand, all this. And me and my buddies, we had a house, on base housing, and we were cooking dinner, and one buddy goes, hey, Mr. Whiskey, can you, go operate the stove, get it started for us? And I said, I don't know how. said, what do you mean? I said, I grew up, that was too dangerous. I wasn't allowed to touch the stove. That's dangerous. And so they were clowning on me because they're like, you were just operating, however much power worth of electricity, of steam, of radiation, but you don't know how to use the stove. And I said, no, chewing gum was considered too dangerous and not allowed in my household. There was a lot of words that were considered bad words that were banned. There was a lot of control over music and television. And, my parents raised me in a very small bubble where I thought New Jersey was all of America and America was all of the world, that every other country was a war zone and dangerous. And, that's how I was raised. And so when I say chaos, it's because it entailed of so many different things. And later in life, if, I won't get into it too much, but the religious weaponization and stuff, being told I was the Antichrist, that, Satan was at the hospital when I was born and begged my father to name me Damien. There's a lot of craziness that went on in my household. And, it wasn't the worst life, but there's a lot of stuff that played factors into how I was raised and how my sister were raised and how it affected me socially. And to give an example, the one time I snuck out of the house to see a girl, of course, because the only thing I was willing to risk, because my parents were insane, so I wouldn't risk sneaking out for anything, but I wanted to see this girl who, ended up friend zoning me because she said when she got romantic feelings for me, it made her uncomfortable because she worried about losing the friendship. So then she just destroyed the friendship. So I said, well, you should have just pursued those feelings and risked losing the friendship if you're going to get rid of the friendship anyway. But hey, to each their own. Not all of us are nuclear geniuses. And so, yeah, when I snuck out to see this girl just to go for a walk with her dog, Dad came out in a cop car and hunted me down. So that's talk about traumatizing.
Wow.
It's bad having your parents track you down and you get home in a yacht. You imagine having your dad show up in the police car and he's got like the death glare on his face.
Yeah. I mean, it almost sounds like your house was kind of like cult ran, just with the strict bubble, the total control over everything that you did. And, it's taken me a long time. When I got out of the military, I didn't really even know what PTSD was or what the symptoms were. I just knew I wasn't happy and I didn't want to live and I just didn't like things. I didn't trust people. There was just a lot of stuff going on that I didn't understand until after I got help. And through podcasting and having guests on and everything else, I've learned quite a bit. And I've learned that a lot of these traumas that we carry, that we don't even know that we're carrying them. They're passed down from other generations. And something happens in your life that you get triggered. And it can affect those traumas that you didn't even know that you had. And people don't understand that because they can't see the map of how it's working. They don't see the swollen ankle or whatever. And it is tough. So I'm sure some of those traumas that you didn't even know about that you're talking about that you found out later, was still affecting you.
Yeah, for sure. I'll tell you a story I've never shared before because it's kind of embarrassing. But when I had gotten out of the military, a couple months later, I went back to visit my friends and they were insisting, let's go get food at the, the food court in we call it the Giga Next, the Big Next. It's like a mall one. And I was like, no, I really don't want to go back on base. I had a lot of issues with my separation, with my command climate, with toxic leaderships, with bad people. My ship set the record for suicide. We had a murder. We've had a lot of bad stuff happened in that area. We had a lot of leadership replacement left and right. And we sat down to eat in that food court and I was a civilian and all that. And, with my ID. And I remember a chief walked past us in uniform and I had like an anxiety attack. I had never had one before, but it was like, and I had no reason to be worried. I'm a civilian now. Like, what are they going to do? But I just had an anxiety attack that this guy was going to start yelling or ordering or like, I didn't want to be back in that position of no power because on my command, my leadership, Master Chief, I'll never forget this, literally said he was treating us wrong and I called him out for it. And he said, I don't have to justify myself. I wear an anchor with 2 stars. Basically what I say is what is the law. He's like, I don't have to justify myself to you, to a petty officer. I do what I want because I wear this anchor with 2 stars. What that anchor with 2 stars is supposed to mean is honor, respect, accountability, and justice, not greed, not power. But like most master chiefs and higher rankings, you could see that he got more food allowance than us. You could see it, but to hear leadership say that, and I had a different leader. I went up to him. I said, hey, you've got us on a duty day. For those who don't know what that is, it's our 24-hour day where you're on call. Most of the time you're standing some kind of watch, sometimes 8 hours, sometimes, more. Every ship and every command is different. But for us, we were almost on port and starboard every other day. It makes life miserable.
Yeah.
And then maybe at the best 3 or 4 section. Meanwhile, topside was 8 section. Some topside groups had no duty days. I went to him and I said, LPO, we've got these many people. We've got these many watch stations. I said, we could have a 6th section, if we did X, Y, Z, ABC, right? But anytime you do something that makes sense, you can't have that in the military, right? It makes too much sense, or it's too good. And this was his response. Y'all have it better when I joined. When I joined, guess what my watch was? I had to watch paint dry on the wall. So I don't care. Unless you have it worse than me, I might feel a smidgen of pity or empathy, but I don't care. We're not going to make life better because you guys already have it better than me when I joined.
Wow.
I was supposed to go to Japan and I got stuck in Newport News. So I hate my life. So I hate all of you. This is the kind of leadership I had to deal with. And like I said, our ship got delayed. We had mass suicides. We had a murder. But there were some good leaders that were able to raise morale a lot. And then we had some leaders that lowered it really badly. Like the MCPON, when he showed up and said, you aren't living, and people were dying. He showed up and said, you aren't living in a foxhole. Lower your standards. Lower your standards. We've had suicides on the ship. Lower your standards. So leadership can there are some bad leaders in the military. And I've had a lot of episodes on my show on why there are bad leaders in the military, how they keep this cycle of replacing themselves with like-minded people, and how the reality is of ranking up, which is kiss up, screw over, and hate life.
Yeah.
Now, every good leader I ever had in the military, it's really sad. This is truly sad. Every good leader I had been deranked once or twice because they put their sailors first. They put their people first because they stood up to authority that said, hey, I wear a big anchor, so I do what I want. And they said, that's not how that works. And they all got out. You know why? Because they said, there are always sailors bigger than me, over me, and I'll never be able to make the change I want. So I'm going to go to the civilian world where I can make change and I can help more people, whether that's military or not. Because in the military, I am stuck in this little box, and the most influence I will ever have is over this little division. And guess what? There's going to be other people who affect my division. Sometimes I can't even control it. So, and not every command is like that. Not every branch is like that, right? There are great people in the military, great leaders, and there are some people you'll meet that are best friends for life. But there's been a lot of bad, leadership, and I unfortunately got stuck with that. It's funny. My sister was like, I love the Navy. I'm at a private resort in Greece with a 50-foot saltwater pool. That's my barracks room. And I said, cool. I have 3 cockroach infestations and no hot water in my barracks room. So it really just depends where you are and who you have in charge.
Yep. Yeah. I had a saying that I always said in the military after I became a leader. I said, the definition of a subordinate is the direct reflection of its leader. And if you had a soldier that wasn't learning or was a problem child and you allowed it to continue to go on, well, that reflects on your leadership style. It doesn't reflect on the soldier. That reflects on the leader. And the reason why I say that is because as leaders, it is our responsibility to adjust our leadership style to how the soldier learns, not the soldier adjust how it learns to my leadership style. And when you get those people that say, well, it's my way or the highway, that works for a minute, but eventually everybody around them gets tired of it. And it becomes a very toxic environment, and you're not going to get the mission accomplished, and you're not going to get the best work out of the people, and you're not going to get retention met. And all of those things play a big part. And that's exactly what sounds like happened with you and a lot of your other junior leaders. I had a colonel that, I ain't gonna lie, scared the living shit out of me. But he said something to me that has always clicked. And he said, my sole reason for fighting to get promoted is because there's people that outrank me that deserve to be fired. And it made sense. It was a unique way of saying, if you want change, then you need to get in a position to make the change. And he was an amazing leader, very hard man. I have no doubts that he's probably a general somewhere. But he just, that's just kind of the wisdoms that I had. And it sounds like I was fortunate. I had some good leaders to mentor me and learn from. So you're in the Navy, and we've got environment that's going on Still got the trauma that has come from your childhood, and now you're on a carrier that's got the longest refuel and overhaul in carrier history. Can you talk a little bit?
Correct. Yeah, so refuel and overhaul, for those of you who don't know, when an aircraft carrier is made, it goes out on this global tour for XYZ years, goes back, you take it all apart, put it back together, and then you go for a tour ABC. And then what happened with us in particular, and this was prior to my time, this was as I was graduating and going through nuke school. As they got to the yard, COVID happened. And for those of you who don't know, a lot of stuff on aircraft carriers, and I'm sure it's the same with some Army stuff, is owned by third-party civilian companies. And so you have to order those parts, or only they are allowed to work on it. That's why you have shipyard workers, civilian side.
Yep.
Well, because of COVID, there was a lot going on. Who's allowed on the ship? Who's not allowed? Are we allowed to go to work? Can we go to work with masks? How many soldiers can we have in one station? Can the civilians enter or not? Do they have to quarantine first? We're getting parts. Do these parts have to quarantine first, right? A lot of stuff ended up, even items had to quarantine for 2 weeks before you could touch them. And for anyone who's ever ordered anything in shipyards, you already know it takes a long time to get it in the first place, let alone now you've got delays in shipping and stuff. And so the refuel and overhaul was taking a lot longer. And it's not the Navy's fault. It wasn't, our leadership's fault. But there's a timeline. And the timeline says after XYZ amount of time in the yards, sailors are good to move back on. During that first half, they're living in barracks or off base, whatever it is, and they commute because it's unlivable. Well, at a certain amount of time, it's supposed to be livable again. You move on. So when big Navy and government said, hey, it's time to move those sailors on, instead of our command saying, we can't do that, sir and ma'am, because it's unlivable, they said, all right, we're going to do it. We're going to meet these deadlines, move people in when there was still toxic gas, hazardous work conditions, no water, sometimes water. Again, this is all prior to my time. This is what I've heard from the sailors before me. And, this led to conditions so bad that people were getting injured on the job. People were not safe. People were miserable, and people committed suicide. We had 3 suicides in a single week. By the time I left my ship, we had about 13 to 14 in a year.
Wow.
With a murder, a military man on his wife, aviation side. And that's a day I'll never forget. I was on watch, and I was in this little compartment, doing plane access watch for radioactive spaces. And I look through the porthole, and I stick my head out the door, and everyone's gone. The ship is empty. It's just me. And that's uncanny. That's kind of creepy. If you've ever been inside an aircraft carrier, it's gray and empty, and you hear all this noise, and then suddenly it's dead silent, and you look, and everyone's gone. It's like an apocalypse movie. And for an hour, there's no one. What's going on? Shipmate comes down and finds me. Hey, Whiskey, were you at the emergency muster all hands call? I said, no, I've been here guarding this radioactive space. No one came and got me, and I'm not allowed to leave. He goes, one of the aviation guys just murdered his wife, and the captain's giving a speech. He's crying. We had a good captain. He cried every time there was a suicide or a murder. He cried. He was an emotional guy.
Mm-hmm.
Was a great guy. And I'll never forget, too, a different day. He gets on the 1MC in the morning crying, and he goes, I just had to make another phone call this morning to these parents that their son was killed on my watch. And he goes, every time I make those phone calls, I have to take responsibility. The chain of command has to be held accountable. He goes, this wasn't a suicide. I've already made so many of those phone calls, and now you guys want to act stupid and add to it. But what happened was, and he shared the story, sailor, drunk driving on a motorcycle, going like 140 miles per hour, hit into something and got split in half down the middle, like a cartoon, got cut into 2 pieces and died. And he had to make that phone call. He goes, it's already so hard enough on me calling about these suicides every few weeks. Sir, ma'am, we lost your son/daughter on my watch on this ship. They took their life. I take full responsibility. And now I have to call because you guys want to get drunk and act stupid and drive like that. He goes, make smart decisions. We're already losing so many people. Morale's already down. And that speech, I felt like really hit everyone's hearts, because it really held us accountable and put us in our place. Even plenty of us were good sailors. We never did anything wrong, but it was like, wow, like it really showed how we affected one another. So like it was crazy conditions. And eventually when, there was enough unrest. Listen, you lose enough people on a ship, their parents are going to get together, media, and get court, right? So the MCPON came down, and his speech, like I said earlier, you're not living in a foxhole. There's worse. Lower your standards. And I didn't hear this speech. I wasn't there. I never met the man. all I can say is in what mindset of anyone, you're going to a command, morale is down, people are killing themselves left and right, and you're going to say lower your standards. You don't need to go to a motivational prep class to get notes on how to talk to people, at least with some common sense, with some courtesy and respect.
Yeah.
The fact that he would say lower your standards, and obviously what military people do is we all made it a joke. We would say lower your standards, like anytime someone complained, be like, hey, just lower your standards, what we had to do, because like morale was just so bad. And like I said, a lot of people, they joined that ship because it was supposed to be in Japan. Now you're stuck in Newport News, and on top of the suicides, on top of the murder, almost every gas station and vape shop and car place in that area was banned because they were shooting sailors. I know sailors, they got shot in the Taco Bell parking lot, in the 7-Eleven parking lot. They shot a Marine 12 times to take his wallet. 12 times, killed him for his wallet.
And
It
probably
is a hell hole. I hate to say it. I hate to say it, but it is a terrible place.
Yeah. It is. It's just funny, that a leader would tell somebody to lower their standards. Because I've had a bunch of soldiers that failed their PT test, and they probably would have loved that idea. Let's lower the push-ups to 2. Let's lower the sit-ups to 4. Yeah, and now all of a sudden everybody's happy. Nobody fails, and you can't live that way. Not in our line of business, in the military, where the decisions can be made that are life and death. And to lower those standards during the training phase is going to lower your ability to fight. And it is definitely insane that a leader would even mention that.
Well, and he was saying in the context of there's toxic gas, there's welding dangers, there's no running water, lower your standards. So he's saying, so what should we live with? Now, I get in combat zones, hey, sometimes all you have is, I knew my RDC in boot camp, he slept in a tank with 5 other guys crammed together so they would have enough body heat to warm up their food. So I get it. There's worse out there. Yeah. But we're not in a combat zone. We are stateside, supposed to be rebuilding a ship to go on this great big mission together. So saying lower your standards, but I will say to your point, the other day I had Christopher Brewer on my show, and he and I talked about, he hated this campaign he did. The Army wants to join you. He said, no, we don't. He said, you can join us if you meet our standards. And he and I had a conversation. From when I joined the Navy to left, they had lowered the PT standards significantly. And, it was dependent on age, on gender, and it was laughable. I got asked in a show the other day, like, what's the most thing that you think civilians get wrong about the military? I was like, everything. Their perception based on the war movies and the military movies. I'll give you an example. Everyone thinks I'm a trained killer because I went to the Navy, that I'm a guns expert, that I know Taekwondo times 10, and that I was climbing ropes and lifting tires and doing, Chris Hemsworth level workouts every day. I said, no. First of all, I went to boot camp during COVID. So it was just, you want to talk about chaos. That was a crazy time. Now, Army Marines, I bet you it's physically demanding, but for Navy, no. But people just assume that like my boot camp was whatever they see on like Saving Private Ryan and stuff like that, that I'm climbing ropes and crawling through barbed wire and mud. And, they think that I get drowned 3 times a day, every day. Like they think they say reveille, and they pick you up and throw you into a pool and drown you for breakfast.
Yeah. It is like that in the Army too. I did 10 years in the special ops community, and it was with the 160th, and everybody's like, oh, what'd you do there?
You must have killed so many people.
Yeah. I did the same thing I did for the other 20 years. I was a mechanic. I just fixed special ops vehicles instead of regular Army vehicles.
But you installed laser beams on them, right?
Humvees with nukes. That was the new mission.
That's gonna be we're gonna make a T-shirt of that now.
So you said trauma doesn't always look like Hollywood makes it seem. When did everything hit, and when was your breaking point?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of different times, and I'll give a great example, especially for everyone who's military based or knows someone. So about 1 in 7 people are addicted or suicidal, right? And one of the greatest conversations I ever had on my show was this woman goes, I never thought I was an alcoholic because I didn't fit that classic image of having a brown paper bag or a black bag walking down the street skinny or under a bridge. But she goes, you know what? Like, that's not what it always looks like, or I'll see some ads, for men with porn addiction, be like, this is what people think it looks like, and this is what it really looks like, and I think that goes with trauma as well. So many people think that if you're traumatized, it has to be cutting your wrist or crying, or that it can manifest in so many different ways. And I even had an episode on how it can manifest in different parts of your body. I had a guest who it was tension in his throat.
Yeah.
Some people it's in their shoulder. Some people it's not physical at all, And so I think that image of like, hey, an alcoholic looks this way, especially I've had episodes on women in alcoholism and how it's so underaddressed because it's always men. And what do you think when you think of an alcoholic man? You picture a guy throwing a beer bottle at his wife's head and beating his kids or something, right? And but there's plenty of guys who are alcoholics who are running $1 million companies right now.
Yeah.
They drink all day in a closet, in the bathroom, in their car, and you wouldn't know it. And that trauma can come out in so many ways. And sometimes it comes out in your relationships. You'll say things or do things you don't realize. I had a great example of a guy who had witnessed domestic violence growing up. And so he developed this mindset, well, as long as I'm not beating my wife, it doesn't matter how I talk to her, because there could be worse. And that was, that trauma had built in this subconscious factor of comparison, when we should all be comparing ourselves to the perfect moral man of Jesus Christ, right? But instead it's always, we compare it to the trauma in our lives. And I've been guilty of that in relationships and friendships, and even as a manager at companies, of comparing. I always assume that everyone has gone through my same level of experience. Therefore, to word it better, my sensitivity is, I guess, very dulled in comparison to some people who haven't been through things.
Yeah.
So like for a living, I talk about suicide prevention, addiction recovery through podcasting, and everywhere I go, I talk about it. And I was on this first date one time, and I was talking about my family stuff and that stuff. Girl started crying, was like, I can't talk about this stuff, and like we're never going on a date again. I even did a little comedy joke about that once, because I found out, what I find not traumatic at all, some people find extremely traumatic. Some people can't have negative conversations at all because they're so empathetic, or they haven't been through stuff, just like, have you met Scott DeLuzio?
I have. As a matter of fact, me and him will be having another interview here in about 2 hours.
Awesome. Yeah, Mr. 500, over 500 episodes. Yeah, so I dare you, call him when you introduce him, say Mr. 500. He's going to know exactly. Hopefully he says Mr. Whiskey. But yeah, he was on my show for Suicide Prevention Week, and I was on his show. And one of the things we talked about was military humor and civilian humor. Now, some civilians will find some of the things we say extremely, like how people on my ship were joking about lower your standards after that. So I shared a joke today. I was telling a buddy at lunch, sometimes people would hang themselves or talk about hanging themselves in what we call Shaft Alley. And we call them Shaft Alley wind chimes. Now, some people would find that, that's awful. Don't get me wrong. That is awful. But a lot of us, it was a morale thing. Same with, everyone jumped off the same building at Nuke School to take their own life. It was the skipjack. And we just talked about like, hey, you guys want to go to the park, hit up the skipjack suicide, or the suicide slide, or we should really install a trampoline there. It was just like, some people, really don't get that. And I think trauma manifests in a lot of different ways. Like, one of the most interesting things, I never realized that I had a woman on my show talk about how eating disorders can be a form of self-harm, punishment. And I never looked at it that way. I looked at it, you always think anorexia, oh, I just want to be skinny and beautiful, so I'm not going to eat, or I'm going to force myself to throw up. And some people do it on purpose as a way to punish themselves, or overeat to like, so it's very interesting. I had a guest on my show who, she would eat a lot because she wanted her fat armor. She said, as long as I'm chubby, people will leave me alone and I'll be safe from the world. So I think it manifests in so many different ways, as far as, how you talk, how you joke, how you eat, how you work out, how you do certain things, how, of course, there's a lot, if we could get into religious weaponization and trauma, it can really affect your relationship with faith, with community, with we've done a lot of episodes on my show about how you observe your parents' relationship, how much it affects your relationship, what you think is normal, how sometimes, like, I had a guy on my show, his dad would get angry and rip furniture apart, and he thought everyone's dad did that. He thought that's just what dads did. I had a woman on my show, dad never hugged her. One time she saw one of her friends get hugged by a dad, and she thought they were a thing. Like, she's like, is something weird going on between you and your dad? Like, why is he hugging you? She's like, what do you mean? She's like, my dad's never hugged me. Dads do that. That's weird. Like, it's kind of crazy to think some of the things we take for granted, or some of the things that we think is normal, because there's a lot of stuff that felt like was kind of normal. And then talking to people later on, they're like, no, dude, that's like abuse or trauma, or, I won't get into it much, but like I was borderline sexually assaulted and groomed by a woman once, and I never took it that way until I was talking to women later in life, and they were like, this is actually like very wrong. And I was like, well, I was fresh out of boot camp, and I just turned 18, and I didn't know better and stuff, and made all these excuses. So I think it's, trauma can manifest in so many different ways. But like you said, to bring it back to your question about like Hollywood, I think it shows a lot of very stereotypical depictions of it. I think if you listen to any mental health podcast shows or anything like that, you'll get a lot of more unique ways that you didn't think. Like a lot of stuff I named right now, I'm sure plenty of people were like, oh, I didn't realize that was a form of trauma coping or trauma, scarring. So, like I said, you have a lot of stereotypical, portrayals of it in Hollywood and stuff. Like I said, the cutting yourself, the way you drink, the way you do drugs, it can manifest very differently in the real world and in ways that don't sell in Hollywood or ways that aren't as cinematic. But it's the truth,
Yep. Yeah. You brought up a really good point. And I've said this before about life experiences is kind of like, think of trauma as like a drug, right? Like a prescription drug, right? And the more longer you take it, the more your body builds up a tolerance to it, right? And it takes more and more and more to affect your body. Well, trauma is the same way, right? Your life experiences, whether they be good or bad, play a role in this. And people judge other people because, and the veteran community is horrible about this. We like to say, well, it only took me 2 months to get over this. What is your problem? And they forget that part of the healing process is also related to some of your life experiences, the good and the bad. And somebody who grew up on the streets of Compton and heard gunshots every day may not be as affected by hearing gunshots in combat, right? Not saying it's not trauma. It's just you're not seeing it yet. Somebody whose worst day was they got a B- in school, maybe just the sirens going off is enough to cause trauma. And you've got to understand where people come from. And that's why it's so important as leaders to know your soldiers. And I don't just mean know their names. I mean, know your subordinates and where they're coming from and their attitudes and their love languages and everything, as much as you can so that you can see these changes that are taking place. It is very challenging. I say that like it's easy, but it really is not. And it's always an ongoing process. It is tough, man, because, trauma is not a military problem. It's not a police problem. It's a human problem. And PTSD is a side effect of trauma. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's symptoms are the same. Lots of people can get colds and have variances in severity of symptoms and everything else. Trauma is the same way. This is how your body deals with something that is bad. And our triggers may be different, but you're going to go through a lot of the same things, the depressions and that cycle. And it is hard to get that through to people that have never been in that situation. So I definitely do get it. And you made a lot of valid points. I hope a lot of people watch your show because just a little bit that you've been on here, man, there's been so many things that are just fact. And it may not be sexy enough for Hollywood, but they are the truth and they are important because if you don't understand where these symptoms are coming from, you're not going to be able to help somebody either.
Yeah. And I think a lot of veterans, self included, I'm trying to work on my empathy because it's hard. I work right now. The one company I manage, it's all high schoolers, the employees. And, to them, a 5-hour shift is like a world. And to me, having worked 16-hour shifts when I was on the submarine at some point, I just have no empathy at all. I remember the first time I worked in a restaurant after nuclear operations, we had to do the dishes. And I've got this guy complaining and complaining. I'm like, this is easy. It's like, I had a veteran on my show who did bomb disposal in Iraq, and he was talking about he's under sniper fire. He's got 2 bombs. He's trying to defuse them, right? And then you're walking through Walmart and you hear employees complaining or whatever it is. It's like such an adjustment. And so I think, like you said, but it's important to try to remember where people are coming from. And I've had trouble with that because, like, my former gym partner, he said I was a bully. and a jerk because I would tease him sometimes. And I'm like, dude, you've never been actually bullied. You've never been actually talked to harshly. But he grew up, still lives with his parents, late in his 20s, never actually had real bullying happen to him.
Yeah.
And so and you know what? Maybe I was a jerk, but I think I and a lot of veterans and anyone who's been through any kind of trauma, that lack of empathy and sympathy it's just hard. It's hard when you've been through worse, and you've seen that, and it's like to try and imagine, like you said, that's one thing I didn't get, through Nuke school. A lot of we had about 1 to 3 suicides a month, and at the end of the day, I understand the stress, the pressure of the school. It's, about, 4 to 6 years of college compacted into a year and a half, maybe 2 years. They call it drinking water from a fire hose. I understand how difficult it is academically. I understand it's not just your schooling, it's a lifestyle. But at the end of the day, if you fail, you don't die, right? You get re-rated or you get separated. But people were taking their life over poor scores. And
Yeah.
this isn't just a Nuke school thing. This is a college thing. This is even sometimes high school.
Yeah.
Like you said, someone's worst day is getting a B-. And there are people who actually take their lives over their schooling grades. I've never been able to understand that mindset, that societal pressure, that family pressure of a failure being the end of everything. Especially when, I've been in some environments where actual failures result in actual lives lost, especially in the nuclear operation field. Complacency kills. Any mistake can be a huge one. Same with diffusing bombs in the Middle East. So I think it's just, and like you said, the veteran community has a lot of that. I've talked before on my show, almost a competition of who can get the least sleep, who was it? Someone the other day, I don't know if I was on their show or my show, but we were talking about the suffering Olympics. Who can suffer the most gets the biggest reward. And it's one thing to be proud of the trauma you've overcome and take pride in it, but to brag about it and hold it over people is a different thing.
Yeah.
I think you should be proud that you've healed and recovered. That's definitely something to be proud of, especially if you've been through some awful, terrible things. But it shouldn't be a trophy you hold up next to people going through something less or something the same at a different rate than you. Like you said, it's not a race.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be a race of who can get over their trauma the fastest. How about who can get over their trauma the most efficiently? And for some people, that's a long time. Some Vietnam vets are still dealing with stuff nowadays, and some of them left Vietnam in Vietnam. To each their own, but it shouldn't be a race. It shouldn't be a competition. If anything,
I agree.
what we need is people supporting one another, saying, hey, I got over my trauma pretty fast, and I have some things that really helped me that I think could be helpful to you. That's what you should be saying, not why aren't you over it yet? It should be, well, how can I help you get there sooner?
But I have a nonprofit that helps veterans become musicians, right? And there's an artist that's on my show. Her name is Barbara Sim, and when she came on my podcast, she had this song called "The Long Way Home." And I asked her, I said, well, what inspired that? And believe it or not, it inspired it because her therapist said, well, it's been a couple months now, and you really should be better by now. And she goes, well, I guess I'm taking the long way home. And that's what inspired that song. But it's absolutely true. Everybody's going to heal different. And there's a pattern. And I don't know if this is just a veteran thing or what, but you can kind of watch this circle of the healing process. And the first thing after you realize, that you're dealing with PTSD is then afterwards, everything that goes wrong in your life is because of PTSD, right? I'm not an asshole. I did that because I have PTSD. Well, you can still have to take responsibility. It's not a get out of responsibility card,
I agree.
And then those next steps is where, when you start realizing that and you start doing the work and you start trying to heal and you go back and you start taking those responsibilities, and it's not easy. That circle is lots of times seems like one step forward, 2 steps back. I wrote a book. It took me probably over a year and a half to get it out. And I wasn't even going to publish it. I wrote it for my kids and my wife because I never explained to them what went wrong, what had happened. I didn't explain to them how I felt after burying friends of mine and then turning around and having to redeploy right back and never even getting the time to grieve. And then when I was thinking about killing myself and walking away from the military, part of my reasoning was because nobody understood me. Well, it's because I didn't explain it to nobody. I didn't talk to nobody. I had bad dreams, and I would sit up, and my wife would ask me what's wrong. I would just say, oh, it's just a bad dream. Well, what was it? Oh, I don't remember. And that was just a lie. I just didn't want to talk about it. And I ended up publishing that book because my daughter asked me to. And I do think it has helped. I've had reviews where family members, not the veteran themselves, has said, I get it now. I see. There's a lot of similarities. Well, it's because, trauma is trauma is trauma. It doesn't matter where you came from. Absolutely. This next question I really want to get into, because I think this is a big part that the VA has a problem with. It says you speak a lot about Gen Z and Gen Alpha and what they're dealing with behind the scenes, and that people are missing, right? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, for the longest time, I didn't realize I was part of Gen Z. So I thought I was a millennial for my whole life until I got confronted about that publicly. So that was embarrassing. But I've always been called an old soul. Most people who listen to my podcast and don't see me think I'm in 30s or 40s, so that's good news. But yeah, it's their behavior, their mindset, everything is different than the generations prior. I think that's actually one of the biggest divides in the military, is that you have a lot of leadership and people who end up stay in for 20, 30 years, right? And so you have leadership mindsets from like the military is on a lag cycle, right?
Yep.
Like their computers, when you're trying to log into NSIPs, it's way behind its time, so I think that's one of the big issues. I worked at a blue collar, and the blue collar industry is kind of the same way. I was at a chemical plant. I was working as an acid utility operator and sulfur worker, as well as a rail car mover. And everyone there, very small team, had been there for 30 years, 40 years, and their fathers had worked and died at that acid plant. So you've got a very ingrained culture. And this was always what I heard. Your generation is stupid, lazy, don't want to work. I remember, I'll never forget this. There was an issue with a valve once, and boss man said, well, there hasn't been an issue with it in the past 30 years. Your generation just doesn't want to work. You want to make excuses to not work. You're entitled. You're always on your cell phone. You're playing those video games, and a lot of that stuff is true for a lot of people, but I don't think it's right to just classify it like that.
No.
And I'll never forget, that boss was wrong about a lot of things. And I remember one time, he said I was driving too fast because I was going 35 miles per hour, and he said the speed limit's 20. I said, no, it's 35 miles per hour. And he said, I've been working here 30 years. It's 20 miles per hour. So I took a video of the speed limit sign I stopped the car, got out, took a video and showed him. And he goes, just no accountability.
Yeah.
One time he said, why didn't you put the, I don't know how to explain it, but like hook this chain across the top of the rail car? I said, I did. And here's a picture of the chain. It's somewhat broken, and it probably came undone when they were moving the rail car. And his excuse, instead of, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it's broken, thank you for showing me, was, well, you should have gotten a tool and tried to fix it, And then ultimately I quit that job because he did not believe me that this rail car could not be dumped because it was solid rock and not liquid. And after 12 hours of arguing, he finally decided to try and do it himself and realized it was solid rock and he was stupid. And no accountability. He just said, work harder.
Yeah.
So I think what I talk about, though, is, one of the biggest issues is the attention span decline, the way social media works, the way everything. And I mean, it affects me a lot. People like you and me who have shows that it's not all sexual immorality or humor or comedy, right? When we make podcast clips, unless you're Joe Rogan or Steve Bartlett, right? One of those big shows, the clips don't go very far because, like my clip I could make a clip about suicide prevention. It could be the answer to suicide prevention if there was one. It could be 100% answer, and I'll get maybe a couple hundred likes at most. Meanwhile, there's a guy who touches anthills on TikTok, and each video has like 1 million plus likes. Like the new generations have just gotten so desensitized to life, to death, the disrespect online, the hate online. It's insane. But go ahead. Do you have an idea?
Yeah, I was just going to say that reminded me when I was earlier in my podcasting days, I ventured off trying to get into YouTube, right? And to me, YouTube is just a challenge. It really is. And I came across this guy called the Sleeping Streamer. And now, I've been posting videos and shorts and all this stuff. And I had like 80 subscribers, right? He had like 30,000. All he does is turns the record button on, climbs in bed, pulls the covers up, and goes to sleep. That's his whole show.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's frustrating. It's very frustrating. And unfortunately, a lot of podcasters and musicians and other people will conform to trends or to other stuff or change their content to chase after that.
Yeah.
But like we were talking about earlier with the military standards, for me as a podcaster, especially as a faith-based podcaster, it's not to conform to this world. It's I'm keeping my content, and whoever attracts it attracts, but I'm not going to compromise my morals or my mission to chase after it.
Yeah.
I've seen some people who, the way they integrated comedy into their show, they changed their subject matter because people just were into it. But now that they're joking about XYZ or they're making ABC, now they've got listeners. But sometimes you got to keep in mind who you're chasing after, because those people who are liking that content, they're not the people you want listening to your content most of the time. I would say one of my most popular episode of all time is actually Gen Z suicide prevention by integrating faith in social media, how to make social media ads that target suicide prevention by incorporating faith. And I think it's so important. Mentoring the youth is one of my biggest passions. It's something I have a couple episodes on mentorship, but ultimately one of the goals I've shared on a couple different shows is I'd like to make a third-party program where enlisted military members and even officers, most of them are 17, 18, 19, 20. On average, that's like typically 18, 19. When they get into the military, and I can't speak for all branches and commands, but most of them, if they get a mentor, it's some random petty officer or whoever it is, sergeant, whatever it is, who got stabbed with this, hey, so-and-so, you already have 20 other jobs besides your main job. We're going to make you a mentor for 5 or 13 people. And that's how it was on my ship. These petty officers would get told, hey, you've got 13 kids you're mentoring now. Have fun. Make sure you meet with them at least once every Friday and at least talk for 10 minutes. Whatever it was. It was just a checklist. It wasn't real mentorship. You know who always picked up the mantle of mentorship, and I don't know if you can speak on this at all, but for me, when I got to my ship, it was the people who were getting out, who had more free time and hated life. They would teach you all the wrong things. You didn't have good mentors. Same with financial advisor. When I was separating, you're supposed to go to TAPS, and then on your ship, you're supposed to have a financial advisor, whatever, physical fitness advisor, all this stuff. It's, again, people who already have 5 other jobs. They just pick some guy in the command. They're like, hey, you're kind of good with money. You're the financial advisor for the command. There needs to be a third-party program where, I'll just use myself, for example. Let's say Mr. Whiskey comes in once a week and has a meeting with these sailors, and I sit down, and I'm certified counselor for finances, for career. And I work in tandem with the military to set these sailors up for success. I don't have to worry about standing nuclear watch. I don't have to worry about security, what time the galley hall open. I am dedicated to these sailors. That is my job. And I'm a civilian, and I'm a veteran. Or maybe it's not a veteran. It could be a civilian. Or maybe it is a military member, and this is their position. Or it's a new rate, a new MOS, mentorship, and that sounds like a waste of money, but there's so many other things that money gets spent on in the military. I think that we could put aside some funding to have proper mentorship and set people up for reenlistment and retention. You mentioned retention earlier, and part of that is if people could be set up financially, physically, and career-wise with the military, and these mentorships work with whoever it is that's in charge of the billets and stuff, and set them up for a life. I talked before on the show. I said, if the military sat down with me, said, hey, Mr. Whiskey, we want you for 20 years. How can we do that? I would have said, hey, I want this amount of time out to sea, and then I want a shore tour for this amount of time. I want to, because for example, for me, getting married, having kids, super important, and maybe some sailors are, hey, I want to be in a party central, and I want to party all the way till I'm 30. And then once I'm 30, I want to, lock in and do a shore tour and get married. Right? There are enough billets and enough commands and not enough people joining the military that we could have it set up where people are happy. I mean, that's all you have to do. If people can get the basic needs for life and kind of pursue their dreams while still in the military, you could keep people for 20, 30 years. But when you have a dream sheet that you just throw away, when you have misleading promises, it ends up making people who get out. I mean, I know more people who get out than stay in. It was so bad. People on my ship wore paper clips on their uniform. That's against people ever re-enlisting. Civilian life is preferred. Paperclip. And they wore it because they're like, no. They were offering up to $120,000 bonus to sign on again for just 2 years because people did not want to do it. By the time I was getting out, basic seaman had a $25,000 bonus to join the Navy for a 2-year tour of scrubbing barnacles and swapping the poop deck.
Wow.
That's serious. They were in a galley talking about it. After taxes, my nuclear bonus was almost the same as some of the basic people joining bonuses. And I felt how some of our chiefs that we had in the nuclear community was like, well, I only got $5,000 nuclear bonus when I joined. Now y'all get, XYZ amount. And then the senior chief will be like, well, I got no bonus, And so, yeah, I remember when I was getting out, they were offering bonuses for pretty much anyone because they were so desperate. But you don't need that big, shiny paycheck. What you need is lifestyle over money, because the paperclip movement on my ship proved that you can't buy nukes, right? You can't just buy their retention. And that goes for any command, not just the nuclear one. You can't buy retention. Some people, you can't offer a high enough paycheck to deal with that leadership in that command anymore. It needs to be lifestyle and standard of living over money.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes to say even more with the newer generation. They do prioritize happiness and family time and stuff like that over a paycheck. And I think that's great. I really do. I wish I would have learned that when I was younger. And it is a big deal. The other part that you said that I think is also important is the fact that at the end of the day, you hit the nail on the spot, right? So we got new generations that came in. So I came in 94 as one generation, right? Then 9/11 hit. And people forget that war lasted 20 years. So now there's 2 more generations that are fighting the same war. And this is why I said that I think this is the problem that the VA is really having a tough time getting a hold on, is how do they treat somebody like me and then treat somebody like the next generation? And then here shortly, that 3rd generation will be retiring, and they fought the same war we did. So it's not like the traumas just went away.
What you're talking about is an issue with Navy medical as well, or any military medical, is it's uniform, right? It is just a check sheet that is the same for everyone. And the issue is you need personalized medical care. And obviously the VA's understaffed, overworked. The money's always an argument. But the issue is, every veteran is different, not just generation to generation, but just veteran to veteran. And, when you say, all right, well, we have a standard check sheet we fill out, standard evaluation, and here are the medications you can select from, that doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to, like you said, checking the block, right? I always joked. I said, if we didn't check the block on our training and we actually, a 40-hour block of training was actually 40 hours, and you added all that up, there's actually more training hours than what's in a year. So I don't know how you can do it, but it is definitely wasn't planned. It was, we need this kind of training. You need, sensitivity training. You need suicide training. You need equal opportunity training. You need, and every time a problem, which was usually a black eye for the government or the military, was presented, they threw a training program in it. And that 40-hour block would last 7 hours, 6 hours, and you'd be done. And it was literally a PowerPoint slide, boom, 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 let's go. Time to go home. And you're not getting anything out of it. And I hate to say it, but I also feel that kind of wore off on our younger leaders. And so when they became leaders and was trying to train tactics and combat maneuvers, I really think that got watered down as well. And it showed, between the way the war transitioned was challenging because people were tired and they were constantly never left out of these major divisions and constantly, I spent 68 months out of my 20 years between Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. That's over 20% of my career fighting. And it is unrealistic to continuously keep sticking people in these positions and just burning them out and then giving them nothing.
I had people on my show who, I remember the one guy's complaint, he was like, we just got back from this deployment in combat. Now you want to send us back out instead of the other division that hasn't done anything yet, this cycle, the rotation. Yeah. And we've talked a lot about the vicious cycles in the military on my show where like they would call us nubs, non-useful bodies, which I think is just super offensive. It's so stupid. The reason it annoys me and stupid is because it would be people who got to the ship like 2 weeks before us, or a month or two.
Yeah.
Once they got senior rate, they would task off a bunch of stuff to us that was their job, not ours, right? and then make our lives miserable. And then a lot of the quote nubs who then became senior rate would do the same to the next generation, right? It would be created this cycle of, and I said it's the same thing in high school where you have the freshman Friday mentality where like seniors beat up freshmen or whatever it is. And then when they become seniors, they do the same thing, right? And it was the same thing, but way worse. And I remember my one friend, he tried to break that cycle on his ship. He said, no, just because I'm senior rate doesn't mean I can task everything off to the new people. They have their responsibilities to do, I have mine. And the other senior rates said, well, if you're going to, act like a nub, you're going to be treated like a nub. And so they tried tasking stuff off to him and hazing him and treating him like he was brand new. And luckily he had a good command climate and the leadership shut that down. But that just goes to show, like, if you try to break this cycle, you get thrown to the bottom of it. And unfortunately, that goes not just for the newest recruits to the senior rates, but then from, petty officer to first class to chief to senior chief or staff sergeant, whatever it is in whatever branch you are in, where you get to that position of power. Now you're going to treat people the same way because most of the people, like I said, the good leaders will get out. But I did, if got time, want to share something a little more lighthearted. I know we touched a lot of serious subjects, so I want to go back to some military humor. So every day we would clean for 45 minutes straight every morning and 2 hours every Thursday. And by clean, I mean look like you're cleaning, because we cleaned this yesterday and the day before that, and for 2 hours the day before that. And they would pick a song, the sailor of the week or whatever, the sailor of the day would pick the song of the day. And one time we're cleaning and I'm like, what the hell is this? It's have you ever seen Moana?
Yeah.
You mentioned having kids, right? It's the opening song from Moana. And the XO comes on after that song. He goes, I play that song because, like Moana, our ship needs to get to the sea. We've been in refuel and overhaul for too long. We don't belong on the land. Like Moana, being beckoned to the sea. We're being called to the sea. We belong on the ocean. And we will get out of the yards. We will go to the ocean where we belong. And in my head, I'm just thinking, everyone told Moana not to go to the sea. She got in trouble for that. She's a rebel. We were laughing, and this same XO gave a speech once. Said, people keep telling us that we're not going to make it. They say, no, you're not getting out of yards, this and that. He goes, I'll tell you this, not no, not maybe, yes, we will. And of course, military guys took that and ran. And they would ask out girls, and they would say no, and they would say, not no, not maybe, yes, we will. That's what the XO said. Or XO, every time he said something, it was just like, we're taking it, a totally different way. But I'll never forget, he played Moana. He's like, we are Moana. We belong to the sea. And he played the opening song. And I was like, this nothing to boost morale like playing Moana. It's a good movie. They should have played it was more like every time something went wrong, they should have played You're Welcome. That's what they should have been playing. Yeah, we had some, like I said, some bad leaders, some funny leaders. We had a leader in the galley. I don't know what they call it in the Army, but in our galley, we had a FSO, food service officer, who was in charge of the galley. He had a title for himself that you had to refer to him as the Great One. And he would speak in the third person. The Great One wants a coffee. Someone better go get it now. The Great One told you to mop, but I also told you to clean the toaster. So why isn't the toaster and he had a cardboard cutout of himself in the galley pointing at the complaints box. Like, put your complaints here. That's leadership right there. You've got a cardboard cutout, life size cutout of yourself, and you call yourself the Great One. You're like, the Great One said liberty is secured. No one's leaving.
I will tell you, some of the things that the senior leadership does. We had a sergeant major. We were deployed, and I'll never forget this. There was this section in the chow hall that just had all these like cakes and pies and just all this fat food, right? Well, it was for anybody, but the sergeant major hated it, and they wouldn't get rid of it. And so what he did is he went and put a scale next to it, and then he put a book down that had the Army regulation for body fat and weight next to it. It said if you have to read this book, you do not need pies. Yeah, I mean, just the stuff that people do. But it's veteran humor. We make jokes about everything. That's how we deal with stress and trauma and everything else. And you see it in the TikToks. I'll never forget the one about what they called him, Freddie Fire. I don't remember what they're called. They were being shot at by a sniper, and they asked. It was like a press person asked them, so who is this? And he said, well, we believe he's a 60 to 70-year-old Afghan male, and he likes to shoot at us. and they said, well, why is it that you're being shot at? And he goes, well, we believe he's blind. And they go, well, why do you say that? And he's like, well, he hasn't hit nothing yet, but he's getting damn close. So I don't exactly remember how that TikTok goes, but I read that and I was like, yeah, that is exactly military humor.
Yeah. Scott Deluzio on my show shared, I think it was his division. They were, walking through the Middle East, and they were like, watch your step, like, and stuff like that. So that's funny. And I had told him, I said, well, if it was me and my boys and someone stepped on it, we would have came into the hospital, they're missing a leg, and I would have been like, told you to watch your step, dude. And you have to, in that whole episode, we talked about how, if you can let it all drag you down. And that's the thing. What do we call them? We call them negativity sponges and negativity vomiters in the military. People who will just, complain, drag you down, make life miserable. And I know it's hard to make the best of it. Trust me. I've had days in the military where no joke's going to cheer me up. Trust me. But, you got to make best with what you can, and it can be difficult. I get it. Like I've said, and like I've shared on this show alone, there's a lot of bad stuff that happened. But at the end of the day, and once you get out, I will say, looking back on a lot of stuff, it's funny now, but I know that at the time it was not at all, but it's the past, you can't change it. So the least we can do is, have a drink and laugh about it. But
yep, absolutely.
Podcast. We could have a podcast about it.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Whiskey, I'm going to bring you up here and let you some closing remarks and tell everybody where they can find your show and where's the best place to reach you.
Yeah, so if you're not watching and you're just listening, on the bottom of the screen, it says coupleonukes.com. That is the best place to find me. There you'll find all of my social medias, all the way to contact me, every show I've been on, and then every episode of my show categorized. So I have every episode in its own category and all the guests in their own category. So you can easily find, if you're looking for Vietnam stories, if you're looking for mental health, physical fitness, physical health, if you're looking for just sleeping health, if you're looking for women's menopause, if you're looking for men's life coaching, everything is its own section on that website so that you can easily find it. The idea of my website is a resource center. So from my speaking to my comedy, to my books, to podcasting, to all the great guests and their resources that I've had, the idea is anyone can go to that website and find some part of their life to improve upon, or to learn something, or have a good laugh. And I'm always open to being on other shows or having people on my show. And so coupleonukes.com, you look that up and you'll find everything you need.
All right. Absolutely. Well, we're going to go ahead and close out here and throw the exit video out. I appreciate all you guys for listening. Make sure that you hit the little buttons at the bottom to find his show. We'll have all those links and everything down there for you. I appreciate you. Y'all take care. Be safe, and don't let the day kick your ass, kick its ass.